Chapter 7. "Allura!" Shiro called, trying to maintain vocal connection with the team. "Did they just fall?" Lance yelled the question, his body as tensed as a bowstring. Keith grabbed at Karan to shift him over so he could look at the monitor himself. They were supposed to be at the mouth of the canyon. How had the ground given way there? It was supposed to be stable. "I'm here," Allura assured, stopping everyone in their tracks on the bridge, pausing the intensity, the sense of emergency, but not lessening it. "Are you all right?" Shiro asked, practically leaning on the monitor that showed the sound waves. "Everyone okay?" "I think so. The ground just, swallowed us. We didn't drop very far. Pidge? Hunk?" "We're here," Pidge confirmed. "We need to get down there," Keith said urgently, looking intently at Shiro. "Let's take a ship and go. Now. They can't stay there." "Yeah," Lance agreed. "Karan?" Shiro said, as though he were requesting permission. Karan looked at Lance, hard, then at Keith, before nodding. "Bring them back," he said. "Allura, we're coming to get you. Don't move," Shiro ordered, even as he was moving toward the hangar door. Keith grabbed Lance by the hood of his jacket to stop him from going to Blue. "Not in the Lions," he maintained stubbornly. "We're taking a ship." "Why wouldn't we use the Lions?" Lance asked, half innocent and half irritated. "Keith," Shiro began, but Keith interrupted before he could say anything. "Not in the Lions," he said again. "Nothing that is powered by quintessence goes on that planet." "But how are we going to destroy the Galra ship if we don't take Lions?" Lance asked him, twisting out of Keith's grip on his jacket. "We're getting the rest of the team and then getting out of here," Keith said. "It's too dangerous." "But..." Lance looked confused, not understanding how he could wake up in a world where Keith would be suggesting an extraction mission over a battle. "We'll take a ship," Shiro decided. "Now let's stop wasting time." They ran together toward the hangar, Keith slowing as he realized Lance wasn't keeping up, that he'd put a hand out in front of him as he moved. "You should stay here," Keith told him, the worry over Lance that he'd hoped to put behind him resurfacing all at once. "I don't think you're up for this." "Shut up!" And just like that, Lance sprinted forward, almost running into Shiro as he sped down the castle hall. It made Keith feel unbalanced to watch him. Was there something wrong or wasn't there? He didn't have time to figure it out. The three of them pulled on clean suits and piled into a ship. Keith jumping into the pilot seat before thinking too much about it. It hadn't been all that long ago where he'd wanted desperately to get off that planet, and now it was all he could think about to get back down there. "Cloaking is on," Shiro confirmed from where he sat next to Keith. "But take it easy when you land. I don't know what the weight of the ship will do to the terrain there. We could end up in a hole, too, or we could bury the rest of the team." "Got it," Keith responded, tuning out whatever Lance was complaining about from where he sat in the back with the weapons and supplies, wishing he'd been more forceful in not letting him onto the ship in the first place. He adjusted the angle of entry into the planet's atmosphere, monitoring the temperature, taking a moment to accustom himself from the void of space to the sunlit surface. The Galra ship was still there, though it appeared that some of Hagar's guard had also dropped into a cave-in. Hagar remained near the ship, a handful of soldiers surrounding her with their weapons drawn. Why were they guarding her that way? The rest were gathered near the edge of the new hole, working out a solution for getting their comrades to the surface again. Keith wondered if it were possible for them to worry the same way he was worried, if they could feel a sense of brotherhood for their companions. He didn't think about it long. "Watch it, Keith," Lance ordered through the intercom as Keith skimmed the ground, intent on getting as close to Allura and the others as possible without putting them in unnecessary danger. "Don't worry," Keith tossed out casually, contrary to his emotions. "I could land us on a soap bubble. You're the one who—" "That's enough," Shiro interrupted, unwilling to put up with their verbal jostling. "Let's focus here." Keith disguised his shrug in maneuvering the ship, turning it around a dozen feet above the surface so that it faced the mouth of the canyon. He felt sweat slide down his cheek as he gingerly set the vehicle. The muscles in his arms tensed as much as possible. keeping tight control for a soft landing. If he'd touched down in a puddle of water, there wouldn't have been a splash. Still, they all paused as Keith cut the power, knowing that as long as they stayed right where they were invisible to the Galra, that they were relatively safe. It took a few deep, steadying breaths to consciously leave that place, despite their anxiety over getting their teammates up and out of harm's way, too. Shiro and Keith ducked low after hopping out the ship doors, rushing with knees bent around to the back where Lance was opening the rear bay, where they had some cover. Keith stopped short when he saw Lance leaning against the opening, remembering the exhaustion of the healing pod. Lance hadn't had any recovery time from that before joining the mission. He looked ready to drop before they'd even started. "Stay here," Keith blurted at him again, physically putting a hand on his chest to restrain him from stepping down. Would you stop that? Lance retorted irritably, pushing him away. "What is your problem?" The truth, that Keith would never admit out loud, was that his entire psyche was resisting the idea of Lance on this soil again, of returning to the canyon where Lance could be in trouble, where he would be responsible for his life again. He couldn't go there, not so soon, not with the suspicions he had that Lance wasn't quite right yet. He fumbled for a better answer. "Actually, I agree," Shiro said, saving him. Lance turned wide, hurt eyes to him. "We need someone to guard the ship and cover us as we're out there in the open. You're our sharpshooter. You're the best choice." Some of the pain softened in Lance's face, replaced with a dedicated loyalty. He pulled his Bayard from his belt, where it manifested into the familiar rifle. He nodded to Shiro. "All right," he acquiesced to staying behind, all closer to him to listen. "Keith and I will secure ourselves to the ship on individual lines, and use 3 more to get the others out while Lance keeps watch. I think we should go one at a time. Pidge, Allura, then Hunk. Once we've got everyone, we take the ship past the Green Lion, drop off Pidge, and cover her until she's in the cockpit. Then we all head back to the castle and leave. The Galra should be too busy with whatever they're doing over there to even see us." "Got it," Lance said, nodding, breaking the circle. They proceeded to unhook the various tools they would need for orchestrating the rescue. The Altean versions of ropes were more like Pidge's Bayard than actual braided lengths, using some sort of tangible synthetic energy than actual material, giving them the benefit of not having to worry if the length was too short, at least up to 600 yards. They hadn't tested it farther, or if a knot would hold. One end secured to a port within the bay, the other to the belt of their paladin uniform, anything they had on Earth, but he still felt the need to test the strength of the system by leaning his weight as much as possible away from the line. Next to him, Shiro instinctively did the same thing. His eyes doubted that such a tiny bit of light would be enough to keep him from falling, but the lack of give as he tried to stretch it reminded him that it was probably strong enough to lift his lion if necessary. "Do not leave the ship unless you're wearing one of these," Keith told Lance seriously, looking him straight in the eye. Lance's mouth twisted in amusement and annoyance at Keith's seriousness. "Actually, don't leave the ship anyway. Just stay." "Yes, Mother," Lance replied, awkwardly. "And leave your visor down," Keith cautioned him. "The oxygen here isn't as breathable as you think." Lance gave him a curious look, as if he wanted to ask him something, but Shiro pulled him away with a hand on his shoulder. "We'll be as quick as we can," Shiro said to Lance, before taking off toward the hole to ask him something, but Shiro pulled him away with a hand on his shoulder. "We'll be as quick as we can," Shiro said to Lance, before taking off toward the hole where Allura had fallen with Pidge and Hunk, leaving lengths of softly glowing rope behind him. The cave-in had been minor, like in those cartoons where someone with a saw cuts a perfect circle out of a floor around a character. As Keith carefully stepped up to the edge, he guessed that they were only 20 feet, maybe less, below the surface. Allura's face was turned upward expectantly, while Pidge crouched against the side, arms around her knees, and Hunk standing next to her with his hand on her shoulder. "They're here," Hunk said reassuringly to Pidge, as he noticed Shiro and Keith peering down at them. "Is anyone hurt?" Shiro questioned again, already lowering a third line into the hole. "Pidge?" Keith couldn't see the expression on her face as she turned it up when she heard her name, but her posture told him everything. She was freaking out. Hunk pulled her to her feet, almost physically straightening her joint by joint. "No one's hurt," Alora responded, reaching up to catch the dock for their way out. "We're wondering what's going on up there, though." "Some of the Galra fell into a hole, too," Keith responded, watching closely as Alora grabbed the line and helped Pidge hook it into her belt. "And some are guarding the witch for some reason." "It's that guy," Hunk volunteered. "The one that disappeared." "He must have escaped," Shiro mused as he and Keith began drawing Pidge up. She held tight to the rope to keep herself oriented upright, clinging with her head tucked close to her chest. "Or maybe he fell into a hole, too?" "No, seriously," Hunk maintained. "He legitimately disappeared. Then the cave-in started." "It doesn't matter," Pidge snapped unexpectedly. Keith could feel the line tense. "Let's just get out of here." "It's all right, Pidge," Shiro reassured. "Get to my lion," Pidge said, rather harshly, as if she'd been repeating herself about it for a while. "Something's wrong with her." Keith couldn't speak around the "I told you so" that suddenly clogged up his throat, so he busied himself with gently taking Pidge's arm as Shiro steadied the line, pulling her the rest of the way out of the hole and onto her feet. "Alora, you next," Shiro invited, starting another rescue line smoothly down. Keith let go of Pidge's arm, only to grab her by the wrist as she made a beeline for the mouth of the canyon. "What are you doing?" he hissed at her. "The Galra are still over there. They'll see you." "My lion," Pidge repeated, completely uncaring about anything else. "Keith," Shiro called, needing his help to pull Alora out. Keith tightened his grip on Pidge's wrist, compelling her with a slight jerk to just listen to him and wait for a minute. "Just think," Keith cautioned. "We are not in fighting form over here. We've got 2 people in a trap and our guard is 20 feet in fighting form over here. We've got 2 people in a trap and our guard is 20 feet away. I know the Green Lion is in trouble too. I tried to tell you before, but we can get her help faster if we all get up into the ship first. So stay." Pidge's face tightened into a sulk. She clearly did not want to wait any longer. Keith stared at her. How could he make her understand that he knew what was going on, but getting Hunk and Alora up was more important? "Let's hurry," Pidge said, letting the tension drop from her arm, her reason catching up to her urgency. Keith released her wrist to help Shiro with Alora. "No, really, guys, hurry!" Pidge bounced on her heels, peering past where the canyon walls gave way, where she had left the Green Lion. "What's wrong with the Green Lion?" Shiro asked, his voice edged in worry and strain as Alora's head appeared at the surface. Keith slipped one arm under hers as Shiro did the same on her other side. Keith answered for Pidge. "Like I said, the planet is stealing her quintessence." Pidge turned momentarily to look quizzically at him. Alora kept her hands wrapped around his arm, also staring. He turned his head to catch eyes with everyone who was looking, intent on proving himself with just the force of his gaze. "Right?" He eventually settled on Pidge to confirm what he was saying, justify what he'd been telling them from the start, shaking Alora off of him. "Keep a sharp eye, team!" Karan's voice burst into all their helmets, making Keith tense. "That rippling is starting up again." "More cave-ins?" Hunk mused as he hurriedly fit the rope dock into his belt. "Could be," Karan confirmed. "Lance, it's closer to you and the ship. Be on guard there." "I would really like to be out of this hole," Hunk said, trying to keep his voice calm. Keith and Shiro were already hauling him up as he tried to walk his way up the side to help them. Keith noticed the sounds of the canyon behind him, filling his heart with remembered dread. The dirt at the edges of the first cave-in was crumbling into it, and there was a sense that the ground he was standing on was actually as fragile as ice. "Come on," Hunk pleaded as he hit the surface, digging into the earth with both hands to pull himself out, even as Shiro and Keith tugged him by his arms. On one side, Keith could hear the rocks crashing into the canyon. On the other, the Galra were also beginning to shout as they discovered that the ground was shifting. "It did this the first time," Alora pointed out for them, grabbing onto Pidge as they all looked downward, as if that could help them prevent or predict where and what was about to happen. Keith felt Hunk's fingers tighten around his bicep and reached out himself to hold on to Shiro. Whatever happened, they would stay together. Whatever happened, they would stay together. A loud crack struck like lightning, followed by a shout from Lance, and suddenly all of them were jerked toward the ship by the lifelines on their belts. Keith hit hard on his side, where he immediately felt himself dragged along the ground toward where he'd landed the ship. Hunk's hand disappeared as he too was pulled down. "The ship's dropping!" Coran shouted. "Break your lines!" Shiro ordered directly after, and Keith used all his muscles to curl around his belt, to shift the dock from his uniform under the tension of his own weight on one side and the ship's weight on the other. "Lance!" he yelled, even as he struggled to not be pulled down a crater. Had he got out? How far was this drop? Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Pidge stop sharply, followed by Shiro and Allura, who rolled without breaking motion to her feet to chase after him and Hunk. She made a dive for Hunk's ankles to try and slow him as Shiro dashed in front, hearing his name being called by Shiro. At last he felt it give and was able to push it up, releasing him from the collapsing vehicle. He skidded to a stop in the dirt where Shiro dropped down beside him. "You all right?" Shiro began, but there wasn't any time. Keith tripped himself, getting to his feet, staying upright only by pushing for forward motion, headed for the newest crater in this miserable world. Did Lance fall? Again? "Lance!" he shouted again, reining in his speed as he approached the new edge, hating to slow and knowing that if he didn't he could make everything so much worse. Lance's Bayard lay discarded a few feet from the edge, and a couple more steps showed Keith that Lance had managed to jump from the rear bay. He was hanging by his fingertips to the unsteady edge. Without stopping, Keith dropped down to all fours, then to his stomach. He heard the rest of the team shouting in the background, but it was faded. There was also the familiar sizzle of energy. He heard the rest of the team shouting in the background, but it was faded. There was also the familiar sizzle of energy weapons being discharged, but that was not his focus. His head was filled with his own panting, and he saw nothing but where he clenched his hands around Lance's wrists, locking eyes with him, surprised to find no fear there, just a resigned sort of fatigue. It looked unnatural to Keith. "I got you," he reassured, trying to ease himself more than settle Lance, digging the toes of his boots into the soil as a rudimentary anchor. He strained against Lance's weight, pulling him up and over the edge. Hunk joined him, and together they raised the Blue Paladin to safety. "Sorry, Keith," Lance panted, with a ridiculous smirk twitching the corner of his mouth, looking more like himself now that he wasn't dangling off a precipice. "I left the ship without a lifeline." Keith stopped himself from punching him in the arm like a victim of emotional whiplash. He tilted his head to glance down the hole, seeing immediately that it was much farther down than where they'd just pulled Hunk up. He couldn't guess the distance. He also couldn't see much of the ruined vehicle. "Shit," he muttered, realizing that they were not going to get it back. "Keith," Hunk said, commanding his attention. He followed the Yellow Paladin's gaze, catching up on the reality of their situation. The Galra had realized they were there. They were going to have to fight. "We're compromised," Shiro was yelling as Hunk dragged both Keith and Lance to their feet. "Let's get through as fast as we can. Everyone to the Green Lion." Lance reacted swiftest to this news, moving forward and sweeping his Bayard off the ground and against his shoulder without breaking stride, taking aim toward the mouth of the canyon where half a dozen Galra drone soldiers were blocking the path they needed to take toward the Green Lion. Pulling his own Bayard free, allowing the energy to pulse up his forearm as it lengthened into his sword, the shield manifesting around his opposite wrist. Hunk joined on Lance's other side, his shoulder cannon also at the ready. "Get behind us!" Keith shouted at Allura, who carried no weapon. Shiro pushed Pidge also into the pocket behind Lance, taking the rear position. Keith shifted the shield toward the front as if it were the point of a spear. Sparks and splashes of dirt erupted around them as the Galra aimed shots, their accuracy increasing as the distance closed between them. Keith worried more about the disruption of the earth than actually being shot. The peppering of the soil could start another cave-in any second. But then one Galra dropped its weapon and fell forward onto the ground, taken out by a shot from Hunk. Another followed as Lance's rifle blast burned through its chest. As they maneuvered closer, Shiro rushed out from behind to begin hand-to-hand combat, disarming as quickly as possible as the rest of the team continued to move forward. "It's working!" Hunk cheered brightly as the cliff face of the canyon disappeared behind him. The Galra fighter plane was visible now, along with another 2 or 3 dozen soldiers who were just beginning to realize that they were not alone on the planet. "Don't celebrate early, Hunk," Lance chastised, aiming and firing, and missing. "Pay attention," Keith snapped, speeding up in order to take on an enemy who was ganging up on Shiro. He snagged the weapon out of its hands with his first strike upward, then sliced through the weak point in the drone's armor under the shoulder to tear into its circuitry. It sparked and fell. But more were coming. The paladins moved faster, trying to break through the oncoming line with good timing and luck. They were being swarmed now. It was unclear to Keith which were drones and which were actual shoulders as he tore into limb bodies over. He couldn't tell if the ground were still shaking underneath him. Allura cried out in pain. Then Lance gave a surprised sort of yelp. "Keep moving," Shiro encouraged. "Don't stop or they'll take us. Keep moving forward." Keith felt sweat drip into his eye, a momentary stinging, but his helmet prevented him from shaking it clear. His chest felt tight, too hot. He twisted to stab an attacker in the back to get it off Lance, who shook himself free of the suddenly limp hands and hopped over the body as it fell. He was slowing down. "Come on," Keith encouraged him, coughing. The original formation of the team had broken completely. He couldn't even see where Allura and Hunk were anymore. There was dust everywhere, kicked up by the battle, by the shots that had hit nothing but the earth. "We need to get back with the others." Lance aimed a blast behind Keith, striking a drone in the head. He let his weapon momentarily droop, his free hand resting against the base of his skull. Keith gestured with his sword, pointing ahead, then bending his knees in a defensive stance as 3 more Galra rushed toward them. He blocked one with his blade, then jerked his head backward in order to knock another in the chest as it came up behind him, using the hardness of his helmet as a weapon. He heard Lance discharge his rifle for the 3rd, and then he heard Pidge screaming. She wasn't ahead of him as he thought. She was still somewhere behind. With renewed energy, he shoved himself away from the Galra trying to attach itself to his back, tearing into it savagely with his sword so he could pinpoint where Pidge was and what sort of help she needed. Before he could make her out, a shadow appeared along the ground. Something massive. He turned to see what was attacking him, lifting his sword protectively, only to see the Green Lion sitting beyond the Galra ship, particle barrier down. But how did the name in echo as Allura and Shiro also screamed for the Green Paladin? The Galra also began shouting, some of them dropping their attacks to point at the lion, completely surprised by its sudden appearance. The robot cat raised to its feet, confusing and terrifying Keith. Pidge was behind him. She couldn't have gotten into the lion that fast to pilot. Why was the lion moving on its own? What had happened to Pidge to require it to do something like that? "Pidge!" Lance screamed, moving backward, simultaneously trying to keep an eye on the lion, the Galra, and look for his teammate. The Green Lion gave a shake and roared, successfully freezing their enemy in their tracks. Shiro grabbed onto Keith's arm as he stood as transfixed as Zarkon's troops. "Where's Pidge?" Shiro demanded, but Keith could only shake his head, pressing a hand to his chest. "No!" Pidge shrieked in the dusty haze behind them, her voice pained and horrified. The light went out of the Green Lion's eyes, and she leaped neatly over the Galra ship, sending tremors through the field. "Stop!" "Retreat!" came a gruff call from somewhere near the opening of the fighter ship. The Galra were more than ready to heed that order. The lion coiled and then suddenly shot through them all, the force of her passing over them knocking Keith to his knees. She tore over their battleground and sprinted into the canyon, vanishing in an instant, the ground shaking under the force of her escape. As the remaining Galra soldiers hurried to get off the planet, the paladins regrouped around Pidge, who was again visible on the emptied field. Hunk was on his knees, both his hands on Pidge's shoulders as she cowered on the ground. The dust began to settle, a hush falling as eerily as the haze. "What happened?" Alora asked, her voice intense and worried. How did you get her to do that? What happened? Alora asked, her voice intense and worried. How did you get her to do that? Lance queried, standing close with his rifle casually in his hands, staring off toward where the Green Lion had gone. I didn't do anything, Pidge yelled, unhinged. She's gone! Calm down, Pidge, Shiro pressed. We need to make sense of what's happening here. She's gone, Pidge maintained, softer now, trembling in withdrawal, her hands clenched and pressed against the sides of her helmet. Our link just snapped. She's not with me anymore. I can't hear her, or feel her, or... She's been taken. Keith looked at Lance, who simply stared at Pidge in dismayed sympathy. He didn't remember, but Keith did. He and Blue had been separated by the planet, too. It's okay, Keith soothed, nodding, looking from Lance. Lance was wearing his curious look again, like he didn't know who Keith was, a tired, worn, old look. It made Keith want to put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. He didn't. This happened before, with Blue. Lance's mouth opened, but Keith talked over him. Your bond isn't broken, just hidden somehow. You can get her back. It's okay. How? Pidge asked, with effort, tears in her voice. I don't know, Keith answered disappointingly. Lance did it. Lance took a step back in discomfort as he suddenly became the focus of the entire party. It made Keith sorry he'd said anything, but this was important. They had to get the Green Lion back. Lance? Pidge began, so hopeful it hurt. Lance's rifle disintegrated back into the Bayard, which then fell to his side as his arms and shoulders drooped. He hung his head, closing his eyes so he wouldn't have to look at his team. I'm sorry, Shiro replied, making it seem as though he were responding to everyone. We'll have Karan land to pick us up. We'll take the other lions to get Pidge's back. We'll figure it out. He looked at Keith directly as he made the plan, anticipating a protest. But Keith gave a tiny nod. There really was no other choice here. It would be a risk, but he thought it might be okay if each pilot stayed with their lion. Their combined quintessence was the most powerful. It wasn't ideal, but there really wasn't anything else to be done. Alora alerted Karan to their most recent situation and plan. Then everyone fell silent as they waited for him to navigate to them. They intended for him to touch down farther away, near where the Green Lion had rested, hoping it would be far enough not to create another rift on the planet and plunge them all down another hole. Hunk stayed close to Pidge, though it was clear that there would be no consoling her as long as she remained separated from her lion. She clung to Lance, as long as she remained separated from her lion. She clung to Lance, as if trying to force him to remember anything that could help her with pure physical contact. Lance comfortingly put his arms around her, but he kept staring at Keith, making him uncomfortable. He moved away, not liking the question in the gaze, not wanting to invite any more conversation about Blue and what had happened before. Keith stared down into the canyon where the beast had gone, trying to figure it out. Blue hadn't moved, except at the very end to save Lance. What was different? Where was the Green Lion going, leaving her paladin behind? It made no sense. Keith? He bit the inside of his cheek, expecting this, but they'd long ago left behind the scenarios where he had any answers. I don't know, he said reflexively before hearing any question. Mostly, he wanted to yell at the entire team. He'd told them that something like this would happen. He'd warned them, and they'd done it anyway. And now they wanted him to just fix it, because he'd done it before, right? But he hadn't. It had been Blue who had saved them the last time. The lion had done everything. But this time the lion had abandoned them. He was at a complete loss and only barely keeping it together, reminding himself that this wasn't like the last time. Karan was still in the castle above them. He was working his way down. It would be 20 minutes, maybe a few more, but he was not stranded down here. He was not alone. No one was injured. Keith, Alora repeated hesitantly. Lance has no memory. But did you notice anything from before? Anything that could help us get the Green Lion back? What exactly happened? Keith turned his head just slightly, keeping his arms folded. He wanted to continue to be petulant, get everyone safe. Red told me that Blue's quintessence was being drained by the soil, Keith repeated. That this... He gestured around him, vaguely capturing everything with a sweep of his arm. This whole planet is dormant quintessence. Blue was only able to move at the end to get Lance because he really needed her. He was gonna die. I don't know how he did it, because he thought their bond was broken too. He wasn't awake. He said her name, but he was also talking to his mom, so I don't think he knew what he was doing. All planets contain quintessence, Alora responded. Otherwise they couldn't support life. That's not what Red said, Keith retorted, trying not to make his tone so biting. This planet is different, and there is no life here. You keep saying that. What does that mean? You sound like your lion actually spoke to you. She did. She did. I mean, sort of. It was amazing, but she didn't use words or anything. Alora's face was full of questions, but the one that stood out the most was actually doubt. Keith knew she wanted to ask him how he could understand what Red meant if she hadn't used words, that maybe he had misunderstood her, but she didn't dare. I can't explain it, Keith said, but I know what she meant. The soil here is dormant quintessence, trapped somehow. That's why nothing can live here. Alora removed one of her gloves, bending down and scooping some of the loose dirt into her hand, crumbling it in her fingers, watching it closely as it shifted. Don't do that, Keith warned her. It can take your quintessence too. Don't touch it if you don't have to. I understand, Alora acknowledged, brushing her hand off on her uniform and replacing her glove. And I believe you about the Green Lion. She didn't rally her strength to save her paladin. Where did she go? I don't know, Keith repeated, hating how they were just talking and wondering in circles and getting absolutely nowhere. He turned a bit more, looking behind them to where Lance leaned wearily on Hunk, Pidge still holding his hand. Nothing here makes sense. Shiro said that you don't want anyone to tell Lance what happened. Alora switched topics as she noticed where he was looking. Keith sighed, folding his arms tighter around him, wondering when Shiro had the time to tell her that. It's not important. We've got bigger problems right now. It's important to Lance. All he knows is that he fell. He has so many questions that he doesn't feel it appropriate to ask, given our situation, but hopefully very soon there will be time for an explanation. We will have to tell him something. I don't know why you would keep it from him. You saved him for an explanation. We will have to tell him something. I don't know why you would keep it from him. You saved his life. No, I didn't, Keith quipped. If Blue hadn't saved us, he would be dead now. I completely failed him. Why would I want to tell him that when he already thinks I hate him? Keith, you can't think that, Alora said, her eyes suddenly huge. It's just not true. Like I said, it's not important. We need to get the Green Lion back. Keith stepped away from her, hoping she would let him go. She put a hand up, as if she meant to catch him and keep him near her, but he ducked out from under it and walked purposefully away. He walked away from all of them, his eyes scanning the horizon, hoping for a glimpse of the castle, even though he knew it hadn't been long enough for Karan to get down to them yet. He walked past a depression in the earth, one of the Green Lion's massive paw prints compressing the soil. He thought back to Pidge's scream, right the 23 miles from where they were waiting to the place where Lance and Blue had fallen into the scar. He wondered how far they had made it. Is someone there? Vrex? Kai? Keith jumped backward at the unexpected voice from the dust. Please? Someone help me! Carefully, Keith moved closer to the voice. It was coming from the other cave-in, the one that the Galra had fallen into. In their haste to leave, they had abandoned one of their soldiers in the pit. Keith's mouth twisted in disgust. Shiro? He called behind him, watching as his leader's head lifted in acknowledgement. Keith waved him over. Guys, come over here. They looked at each other for a second, some of them coming to their feet, before making their way to join him. They left you behind, huh? Keith spoke to the Galra in the hole, peering in just enough to confirm that there was only one, again about 20 feet from the surface. The Red Paladin, the Galra muttered, a hesitant hope in his voice. They both knew they weren't friends, that if they had met under any other circumstances they would never have spoken to each other. But today was different. The soldier needed a rescue. Keith needed information. It was barter time. "What is it, Keith?" "Oh," Shiro said as he joined him. They were all there now, standing around the fallen soldier. When Keith had appeared at the edge, the Galra man had been stretched against the side of his prison, arms lifted as if he could somehow reach the top. As more and more of his enemy appeared above him, he began to cower, pressing himself against the opposite side from where they stood, his body language clear in that he knew he was in a horrible spot, completely at their mercy. "What's your name?" Shiro asked him, pity coating his expression. "What were you?" Shiro asked him, pity coating his expression. "What were you doing here?" Pidge shot in, overly emotional. Shiro put a hand on her arm to keep her quiet, and she bit her lip hard. The soldier looked to each of their faces before shaking his head. "We can help you," Shiro told him firmly, "but first you're going to have to help us." "They'll kill me if I tell you anything," was the answer. "They've killed you anyway," Keith pointed out flatly. "You know it." The soldier looked to the ground, the muscles in his shoulders relaxing. "How about this?" Shiro said. "You give us some answers, and we'll help you out of the hole. To be your prisoner? No." He turned his attention to Lance, who had his rifle at the ready. "Just shoot me." "Sorry, I don't do requests," Lance told him. "And we don't take prisoners," Shiro continued. "If you help us, we can take you somewhere safe." "Let's just leave him," Pidge said. "Somewhere safe." "Let's just leave him," Pidge said, unable to keep quiet anymore. "If that's what he wants," Shiro agreed, an edge to his voice that reminded Keith that he had been a Galra prisoner not too long ago. "What do you say?" The soldier looked down, his internal struggle obvious. "Going once," Shiro said, as Pidge and Hunk left the perimeter of the hole. Keith watched fear dilate the Galra's eyes as his head snapped back up in panic. "Twice?" Allura and Hunk also stepped backward, out of eyeshot. "And... all right," he shouted, raising a hand, defeat in all his limbs. "I don't know what help I will be, but I'll tell you what I can. Please. Mercy." "Good choice," Shiro complimented, then surprisingly dropped himself down into the hole with the trapped Galra. Allura gasped, and Lance tightened his hold on his rifle. Keith understood. "We're in this together. Sign of good faith. So let's have a chat." "What do you want to know?"